A couple of Southwest Technical preamps, 198A I believe. These are both very old, of course. 40 years old or better. This one's a newer revision. My four boards are complementary symmetry, 8 transistors. This preamp follows what the original preamp did and has 7 transistor boards. I think because he couldn't really get the DC worked out really well on these boards. They kind of drift with different transistor values. And he had these little pots on these older boards so you could adjust out that indifference, but it was kind of funky the way he did it. If there was a big indifference, it would be kind of tough to... You're kind of upsetting the AC path too if you adjust the pot. Where these don't have any pots, 7 transistor boards, kind of a... It doesn't have the four-legged input, basically. Anyway, Kurt's had issues and mine had issues. I think we fixed both of them at this point. Kurt's was nothing major, just switches needed cleaning. That's real typical on these. Mine, the switches are pretty much... They've all been replaced before, but this preamp was, like I said, 40 years old. So they're all pretty bad. I did clean them all. This preamp had a really odd problem, though. Power supply was all out of whack. 2 of the caps were bad. And I kind of stopped when I saw these caps. I just kind of stopped and said, well, those aren't going to stay in there. This is the one I could see from the tops. It's all bulging, and the one cap actually tests okay. The other cap doesn't test at all. Those were definitely a problem. They were pulling my current down. I had more than 1.5 volts difference in the, between positive and negative. This wire's off just because of the pilot light I think I had. Just for hum, I was trying to get rid of hum. This preamp has a little hum to it. Not real bad if you manage it correctly. But putting the power supply inside the preamp transformer right there next to the board isn't really ideal. So the newer preamp, they took the power supply out of the preamp and they put it in a wall wart. At least the AC part of it. And then this side they put regulators on the board. There was 2 transistors here, not regulators but transistors. He's changed it out and put regulators in instead. I kind of didn't like his outboard idea, but as long as it doesn't get jerked around too much, it'll be fine. So 2 preamps both fixed, I guess, at this point. My balance control is shot and so is his. And I know I replaced this balance control once before, so other than that though, we're pretty much back to normal. I replaced these 2 caps. These 2 big caps were, those pink caps were here, where they got the green ones now. And these caps were already in there, changed them out decades ago. 50 volt caps, so they're gonna be fine. And the other caps were original. It all seems to be working. The good on these preamps is they're very low distortion. The bad is they just made them so light that you try to push the buttons and you're pushing your preamp around unless you hold the preamp. So that was kind of bad. You kind of got to hold the preamp to push the buttons. And these selectors kind of wear out because they're double ganged. It's a big mess. Double gang push switches. So reliability is not great on those. But curiously, we both had power supply problems. I had that bad cap. I got that fixed. And then I still had a problem. I still had a short somewhere on the one channel. I couldn't get any audio out of it. It turned out it was just these jumpers. There's little jumpers on the PC board down here, and there was a little corrosion on them, but I guess it was enough to make a short. I was measuring in the single-digit ohms, short to ground on that, and I had to track it down to where it was and clean it. But all in all, it's working now, finally. This preamp hasn't worked in a long time. I haven't used a preamp in years, probably 5 years I've been using. I've got a DAC right feeding my power amps, basically. No preamp at all, just a DAC. The problem with that is I can't use certain accessories. I can't use my tuner and my CD player in this way, I can just use the computer stuff, which is mostly what I do, but there's a lot of good CDs I have I'd like to hear again. Well, plus a phono, hooking a phono to it, obviously, is a big one. Well, at least we've made good progress on these 198As. Mine, of course, I've got switch problems, and I still do. But that's something I just got to live with pretty much. But mine, I had the 2 electrolytics I talked about earlier, and I put 2 of new electrolytics in back there, those green ones I got from John. But basically I was starting to troubleshoot the power supply in this one because I had 1.5 volt difference in the one polarity. They didn't match up. And then I looked at the capacitors. Holy mackerel. I don't know if you can see that. I need more light here. They're both bulging a little bit. The one tested okay. This other one, you can see a little bit of electrolyte pooled on it, and it's bulging worse than the other one. This one was just Doesn't test at all on my little tester. So a good way to test capacitors is with a tester like this, ESR tester. I did a little, if you look way back, I did a thing on this one. I explained it a little more. But you measure the equivalent series resistance, and you got a little chart here, so you can estimate what you'd expect to have. And if what you do have is way higher, then you know you've got a bad capacitor. Now this doesn't tell you capacity of a capacitor, and that kind of unit has value too, but usually if there's a problem like that, you're going to see it in the impedance. So it'd be nice to do both, but for one test of a capacitor, I'd do this. You can check for leakage too, of course, and this doesn't really do that. This checks for equivalent series resistance. It does it quite well. You power it up, and you always power it up with the leads clipped together. That's what I had to learn, and that self-calibrates itself. And then you put your cap in here, and it measures the equivalent series resistance. Now, it also works very well for small value resistors, less than an ohm. Anyway, I explained all that in a different video. But one wouldn't even register on this thing. It wouldn't even show me a value for it. And the other one tested almost normal. I mean, it tested pretty good. I didn't do a capacity on it. And what I was getting to on the equivalent series resistance is if you use one of those capacity testers that some DVMs have that uses a leakage current to charge up the capacitor and times it basically, that type of meter with a high ESR will get fooled into reporting a much higher capacity than it really has because it took so long to charge. But it's really a bad thing because there's the equivalent series resistance in the thing. This is a schematic of the 8 transistor, and unfortunately we don't have a manual for the newer revision. If anybody can help us with that, I'll give you an address to me or Kurt to send it to. We don't really have a good copy of the more modern version of this preamp. And I do have the cover for this one. It's still in pretty good shape. Kurt made a really nice cover. I'll show you that as I wrap up here. Because I show a FET here from an older preamp design on the schematic and the cover. That always got me. This has no FETs in it. It does very well with bipolars on the input. 2N5210 and 2N5087 or 5089. So these transistors have been around a long time. Of course, these amps have been around a long time, so there's your evidence. And they're low noise. They were made low noise to start with. The trouble is matching the gain on them. PNPs, NPNs. That's where you got to play around a little bit if you really want best results. And with my preamp, with the 8 transistor boards, I was talking about having this adjustment. It's a little bit funky. You got a pot on them all. Here's the version for the phono preamp, the more sensitive. This does the microphone and phono preamp basically. Whereas the other side does everything after the switching and everything. It's actually a tone preamp, I should say. We got all these 2 tone boards, and they work with a feedback loop of these preamps on this side. And your tone controls actually are active, they're not passive. They're active with into the feedback loop of these 2 modules on the output side. So those do output, and they also do tone. And they act like a buffer from the input stuff. The power supply on the older version is pretty simple. All you have for regulation is those 2 Zerners, and the resistors, of course, and 2 sets of capacitors. The later ones had regulators in them. Kurt's had transistors set up as regulators, but he converted his to, I tried to get him doing the other side and mounted on the metal, but anyway, he put 2 heat sinks in and let them stand on the board there. It doesn't get moved, so hopefully they'll stay together. It's amazing though, if you don't support electrical components, flapping in the breeze, like EV blog says, flapping in the breeze. The problem with that is just moving around normal household and heating and cooling and temperature variations and just normal stuff. They end up, you wouldn't think so, but they end up breaking. And we'll see how this fares at his home. But that's basically it. Your output board basically works with all these. So this is not the stock case for this unit. The stock case is a real thin plywood type thing with a laminated, and by thin I mean less than 1/8 of an inch. I mean it's maybe 1/10 of an inch thick, and they did hold up pretty well for me at least. They all look, they're kind of tacky. Something like this make it look a lot better. She's got a little nick in it already. So that's something you can do. Gives it some weight. So because it's a bad design in that it moves around. Try to press the buttons, so you really end up putting your hand on it and then moving with your fingers or other way around. You end up with having to support it rolling back. So that was really the worst thing about the preamp. The other thing bad about this preamp is the inputs, which is always our trouble, and he's had trouble with his. That's the only thing that was really wrong with this one. might have been trouble. I actually replaced all my switches about midway through its life, but that's like a 40-year-old preamp now. Those switches are old too now. Yep, a lot of miles in this preamp. I still got a tiny bit of hum in this guy. I got rid of most of it. But that's how this preamp always was. You had to mess with all the cables and everything. And that's why, like I said, they moved the transformer out of here, which is, I'd like to do at some point myself. Yeah, so in the older version, I put those cards back in. Transformer was in back, right in the unit. And it makes it really hard to get the hum out of the unit. You got to play around with cords and jumpers and make sure everything's in just right. The other failing of these preamps, I keep talking about the failings. The good thing about these preamps is they had perfect sound, really good sound, but totally audiophile. But some of the execution of this preamp was just kind of cheesy. The way they did the jacks onto the PC boards, kind of a good idea, but they could have used a better quality of jack. Maybe not back then, probably was the only one out. But at least nowadays you can get better quality jacks than this that'll go on a PC board. A lot better. And they got that transformer out of there in the later ones. That was a good idea, and they regulated them. And this has been hacked a little bit. His balance switch broke, so you can bypass it with a couple of resistors. You could just clip it all out. It doesn't really hurt. But my balance switch, which was working and I had replaced once before, well, I guess I got it freed up. But I don't think it's even working electrically at this point. So my balance switch is dead again. I've had a lot of different parts in this preamp. It's been around a long time. Rough life. Went to college with me and everything else. Several moves. The other reason I really like this type of tester, ESR tester, of the 3 different ways I talked about testing a... Oh, did I talk about it? So there's basically 3 ways to check a capacitor. Ohm meter, or DVM I should say, a unit like this, equivalent series resistance testing, or a DVM with a charge up function. It'll charge the capacitor and time the charge, and then estimate the capacity of the capacitor. Of the 3 types, this is the best in my opinion, because you can do this in circuit most of the time, because you're looking for a high ESR, not a low, and if your ESR is a little bit high, the rest of the circuit will just make it look lower, so it could fool you that way, give you a false positive. But test bad in this unit. It's bad. A bad ESR is a bad ESR. It's time to throw the thing away.